Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, stands as one of the most influential figures in Islamic intellectual history. A polymath whose works span theology, philosophy, jurisprudence, and mysticism, al-Ghazali's contributions to the development of Islamic thought continue to resonate through the ages. His profound influence on the intellectual and spiritual life of the Muslim world has made him a central figure for both traditional scholars and modern thinkers. Al-Ghazali's legacy is not confined to one particular area of thought, but rather transcends disciplinary boundaries, shaping a variety of fields within Islamic scholarship. Al-Ghazali's importance lies not only in his ability to synthesize different strands of thought, but also in his ability to bring about a profound transformation in the way Islamic scholars and spiritual seekers approach questions of faith, reason, and practice. His critique of philosophical rationalism, his contributions to Islamic mysticism, and his reformulation of Islamic theology helped shape the course of Islamic intellectual history. The lasting impact of his work is evident in the reverence with which he is regarded across different Islamic traditions, from the Asharite theological school to the Sufi brotherhoods. At the heart of al-Ghazali's thought is the tension between reason and revelation, a theme that defines much of his intellectual journey. Al-Ghazali's engagement with philosophy, especially his critique of the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian traditions, set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He questioned the applicability of human reason in comprehending the mysteries of the divine, challenging the philosophical schools that sought to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. This critique led him to emphasize the importance of revelation and mystical experience as paths to knowledge, positioning him as a key figure in the development of Islamic mysticism or Sufism. Another cornerstone of al-Ghazali's legacy is his ability to reconcile Islamic orthodoxy with spirituality. His magnum opus, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, remains one of the most significant works in the Islamic intellectual tradition. In this work, al-Ghazali seeks to rejuvenate the spiritual and moral practices of Islam by integrating the outward observances of religious law with the inner dimensions of mysticism. The Ihya addresses issues ranging from theology and ethics to worship and social conduct, providing a comprehensive guide for a spiritually fulfilling life within the framework of Islamic law. Al-Ghazali's intellectual contributions are not confined to the realm of spirituality. As a theologian and jurist, he played a crucial role in consolidating the Asharite school of theology. This school, which emphasized the absolute power and will of God, became the dominant theological tradition in Sunni Islam. Al-Ghazali's defense of Asharism, particularly in his work Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, is a foundational text in Islamic philosophy. In this work, he critiques the philosophers' reliance on reason and logic, arguing that their views on the nature of God and the cosmos were incompatible with Islamic teachings. Despite his deep involvement in theological and philosophical debates, al-Ghazali's life was marked by an ongoing spiritual quest. His famous crisis of faith, which led him to withdraw from his academic position and embark on a period of spiritual reflection, is central to understanding his legacy. This spiritual transformation gave birth to his works on mysticism and asceticism, where he stressed the importance of inner purification and the cultivation of a direct, experiential relationship with the divine. His writings on Sufism, such as Kimiya al-Sarada, The Alchemy of Happiness, provide a systematic account of the spiritual practices necessary to achieve closeness to God. Al-Ghazali's exploration of mysticism was not an escape from reason, but rather an extension of his critique of rationalism. He argued that reason, while valuable, had its limitations when it came to understanding the divine. For al-Ghazali, the path to true knowledge required a balance between intellectual inquiry and spiritual insight. His synthesis of theology, philosophy, and mysticism laid the foundation for later developments in Islamic thought, influencing both Sunni and Shi'i scholars, as well as the broader Sufi tradition. One of the most remarkable aspects of al-Ghazali's legacy is the extent to which his work transcended the boundaries of the Islamic world. His influence extended far beyond the borders of the Middle East, reaching the intellectual circles of medieval Europe. Western philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas were exposed to Al-Ghazali's critiques of Aristotelian philosophy, which in turn shaped the development of Christian scholasticism. In the modern era, scholars have continued to engage with Al-Ghazali's works, exploring his ideas in the context of contemporary debates in philosophy, theology, and spirituality. The reverence in which Al-Ghazali is held is also a testament to his ability to engage with the most pressing issues of his time in ways that continue to resonate today. His critiques of the philosophical and theological traditions of his day were not mere academic exercises, but were motivated by a deep concern for the spiritual health of the Muslim community. Al-Ghazali's legacy thus extends beyond his intellectual achievements, encompassing his moral and spiritual vision for a just and pious society. His works remain a vital resource for scholars and practitioners seeking to understand the relationship between reason and faith, the self and the divine, and the individual and the community. Al-Ghazali's enduring relevance can be seen in his ability to address universal questions about the nature of knowledge, the purpose of life, and the path to spiritual fulfillment. In a world where the boundaries between reason, religion, and spirituality are often contested, Al-Ghazali's thought provides a framework for reconciling these seemingly disparate elements. His life and work continue to serve as a bridge between intellectual traditions, offering insights that speak to both the challenges of his time and the concerns of the modern world. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was born in 1058 in the city of Tus, located in present-day Iran, during a time when the Seljuk Empire was at its peak. Tus, though relatively small, was an intellectual and cultural hub in the region, with a rich history of scholars and religious thinkers. Al-Ghazali's early life, marked by both hardship and opportunity, would later serve as the foundation for his intellectual and spiritual journey. His family, while not wealthy, was deeply religious, and his father, a local scholar, recognized the value of education from an early age. Al-Ghazali's upbringing in a religious environment shaped his future path, both in terms of his intellectual pursuits and his moral and spiritual values. The loss of Al-Ghazali's father when he was just a child marked a pivotal moment in his life. His father's death left him orphaned at a young age, and the responsibility of caring for him fell to his mother. Despite these early hardships, Al-Ghazali's mother ensured that he received an education. She sent him to study at the local madrasa, where he began his formal education in the Islamic sciences. These early years would be instrumental in shaping his intellectual future, as they exposed him to classical Islamic education, including subjects such as law, theology, logic, and rhetoric. Al-Ghazali's thirst for knowledge quickly became evident. He was a bright and diligent student, displaying an eagerness to learn from an early age. His teachers at the madrasa recognized his talent, and he excelled in his studies, showing particular aptitude in the areas of jurisprudence, fiqh, and theology, ilm al-kalam. By the time he reached his teenage years, Al-Ghazali had mastered many of the foundational texts of Islamic thought, and his reputation as a gifted student began to spread. His early education laid the groundwork for his later intellectual achievements and provided him with the tools to critically engage with the intellectual currents of his time. In his early 20s, Al-Ghazali traveled to the bustling intellectual center of Nishapur, where he sought out renowned scholars to further his education. Nishapur, a city renowned for its scholars and thinkers, was an important stop in Al-Ghazali's quest for knowledge. Here, he studied under some of the most prominent scholars of his time, including the famous jurist Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. Under al-Juwayni's tutelage, Al-Ghazali deepened his knowledge of Islamic law, philosophy, and logic, and it was here that his intellectual abilities truly began to shine. His teachers in Nishapur recognized his talent and potential, and they encouraged him to continue his studies. It was during his time in Nishapur that Al-Ghazali's intellectual interests began to expand beyond traditional religious scholarship. He became increasingly interested in philosophy, particularly the works of the Greek philosophers who had been translated into Arabic. The philosophical ideas of Aristotle, Plotinus, and other Greek thinkers were gaining influence in the Islamic world, and Al-Ghazali was no exception to this intellectual wave. He began to study the works of these philosophers critically, grappling with their ideas and questioning their compatibility with Islamic teachings. This period of intellectual exploration marked the beginning of Al-Ghazali's lifelong engagement with philosophy. After several years in Nishapur, Al-Ghazali moved to Baghdad, the heart of the Seljuk Empire and one of the most important intellectual centers in the Islamic world at the time. In Baghdad, Al-Ghazali became part of the intellectual elite, where he began to teach at the Nizamiya College, one of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the empire. It was in this environment that Al-Ghazali's fame as a scholar truly began to flourish. His teaching at the Nizamiya College allowed him to engage with the brightest minds of his generation, and he quickly established himself as one of the leading scholars of his time. While in Baghdad, Al-Ghazali's academic pursuits took a significant turn. He was appointed to a prestigious position as the head of the Nizamiya College, a role that placed him at the forefront of Islamic scholarship. In his capacity as a professor, Al-Ghazali taught a wide range of subjects, including jurisprudence, theology, and philosophy. His lectures were well received by students and scholars alike, and his intellectual reputation continued to grow. However, despite his professional success, Al-Ghazali began to experience an internal struggle. He found himself increasingly disillusioned with the limits of intellectual knowledge and reason. This internal conflict would eventually lead him to question the very foundation of his academic career and embark on a spiritual journey that would radically alter his life. It was during his time in Baghdad that Al-Ghazali began to develop a growing sense of dissatisfaction with the world of academia. While he was widely respected as a scholar and teacher, he began to feel that intellectual knowledge alone was insufficient for understanding the deeper truths of existence. This sense of intellectual exhaustion led him to question the reliability of reason and human knowledge, which were central to the philosophical traditions he had been studying. He began to question whether the pursuit of knowledge through reason alone could lead to true spiritual fulfillment, or whether there was something more beyond the grasp of human intellect. Al-Ghazali's dissatisfaction with his academic career was compounded by the growing political and religious tensions within the Seljuk Empire. Baghdad, as the seat of political power, was also a city marked by political intrigue, corruption, and the manipulation of religious institutions for political gain. Al-Ghazali became increasingly aware of the moral decay within the religious and political elite, which further fueled his disillusionment with worldly pursuits. He began to see the limitations of his scholarly life and realized that intellectual achievements, no matter how impressive, could not provide him with the peace and clarity he sought. This period of spiritual crisis and intellectual uncertainty eventually led Al-Ghazali to make a dramatic decision. He chose to leave his prestigious academic position and withdraw from the public eye. At the height of his career, he walked away from everything: his position, his fame, and his material comforts, in search of a deeper understanding of the self and the divine. Al-Ghazali's academic career was marked by rapid ascension, not only due to his intellectual brilliance, but also because of his capacity to synthesize and communicate complex ideas with clarity. After completing his studies in Nishapur and under the guidance of Imam al-Juwayni, Al-Ghazali made his way to Baghdad in the early 1080s. At the time, Baghdad was the intellectual and cultural heart of the Seljuk Empire, a city where scholars, poets, and philosophers from across the Islamic world gathered to exchange ideas. It was here, amidst this intellectual vibrancy, that Al-Ghazali's name began to rise within academic circles. Al-Ghazali's appointment to a teaching position at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad was the pinnacle of his academic journey. The Nizamiya was one of the most prestigious institutions of learning in the Islamic world, attracting some of the brightest minds of the time. The college's curriculum covered a wide range of subjects, from Islamic law, fiqh, and theology, kalam, to philosophy and logic. Al-Ghazali's expertise spanned these fields, but it was his deep knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence and his ability to debate and teach philosophy that distinguished him from other scholars. His lectures were known for their intellectual rigor and clarity, and students flocked to hear him teach. In Baghdad, Al-Ghazali was not merely a teacher. He was a scholar at the forefront of Islamic thought. His work as an educator placed him in a position to influence the next generation of Islamic intellectuals. He developed a reputation for his deep understanding of Islamic legal theory and his ability to challenge the prevailing views of his time. His success as a scholar was not just due to his intellectual capabilities, but also because of his charisma and ability to inspire students. Al-Ghazali was known for his passion for learning and his unwavering commitment to the truth, which made him a beloved figure in Baghdad's academic community. His rise to prominence was further solidified when he was appointed as a professor of theology and jurisprudence at the Nizamiya. At this time, Al-Ghazali was seen as the heir to the intellectual legacy of his mentor, Imam al-Juwayni. His work as a professor at this prestigious institution made him a central figure in the academic world of Baghdad. He quickly gained recognition for his ability to engage with complex theological and philosophical issues, and his students looked up to him as a master of both Islamic jurisprudence and the broader philosophical traditions of the time. Al-Ghazali's success, however, was not without its challenges. Baghdad, in the late 11th century, was a city filled with intellectual tensions. The flourishing of philosophical ideas, especially those influenced by Greek thought, had created divisions within the Islamic intellectual community. The dominance of rationalist philosophers, particularly those who followed the Aristotelian and Neoplatonic traditions, threatened the established theological and juristic foundations of Islamic thought. Al-Ghazali found himself at the center of this intellectual battle, as he sought to reconcile the various schools of thought within Islamic theology while remaining faithful to the core principles of the faith. One of Al-Ghazali's most significant challenges was his growing disillusionment with the philosophical schools of his time. While he initially sought to engage with and understand Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, he became increasingly critical of their approach to theology and metaphysics. Al-Ghazali's encounter with philosophy, especially the works of the Falasifa, Islamic philosophers, would ultimately lead to one of the most important and controversial moments in his career, his critique of philosophy in his seminal work Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. This work would not only challenge the ideas of the philosophers, but also mark a turning point in Al-Ghazali's intellectual development. At the heart of Tahafut al-Falasifa was Al-Ghazali's critique of the philosophers' reliance on reason as the sole means of understanding the divine and the cosmos. He argued that their rationalism undermined the central tenets of Islamic theology, particularly the notion of divine will and omnipotence. For Al-Ghazali, the philosophers' commitment to rational inquiry often led them to deny the possibility of miracles, the free will of God, and the role of revelation in guiding human understanding. His critique was not a wholesale rejection of philosophy, but rather a call for a more balanced approach that recognized the limits of reason in matters of faith and divine knowledge. While Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy was groundbreaking, it was not universally accepted. Many of his contemporaries, particularly those who aligned with the rationalist traditions, saw his attack on philosophy as a threat to intellectual progress. Yet, Al-Ghazali's stature as a scholar and his deep understanding of both Islamic law and philosophy ensured that his views were taken seriously. His position as a leading intellectual in Baghdad gave him the authority to challenge the prevailing philosophical orthodoxy, and his work sparked widespread debate across the Islamic world. Despite the controversy surrounding his philosophical views, Al-Ghazali's intellectual career flourished. He continued to teach at the Nizamiya, influencing countless students and scholars. His ability to bridge the gap between Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy allowed him to shape the direction of Islamic thought during a period of intense intellectual ferment. Al-Ghazali's academic career was marked not just by his personal achievements, but also by his broader influence on the intellectual climate of his time. His work helped to define the contours of Islamic theology and philosophy, laying the groundwork for future generations of scholars. Yet, Al-Ghazali's growing sense of spiritual dissatisfaction would eventually lead him to step away from his prestigious academic career. The very success that had made him a leading intellectual figure in the Islamic world became the source of his inner turmoil. As Al-Ghazali immersed himself more deeply in his studies and teaching, he began to feel the limits of intellectual inquiry in addressing the deeper questions of existence and the divine. His famous crisis of faith, which would lead him to withdraw from his academic position, was not a rejection of knowledge per se, but a recognition of the need for a deeper, more direct relationship with the divine. Al-Ghazali's intellectual journey, deeply rooted in Islamic scholarship, took a significant turn when he began to engage with the works of Greek philosophers, particularly those of Aristotle, Plotinus, and their Islamic commentators. The 11th century was a time of intellectual flourishing in the Islamic world, marked by the translation and assimilation of Greek philosophical texts into Arabic. The translation movement, begun centuries earlier, had introduced the ideas of Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers to the Islamic intellectual tradition. These texts, along with the commentaries by thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, began to influence the intellectual climate of the time, creating new paradigms of thought that challenged the established theological and juristic norms. Al-Ghazali's early exposure to these philosophical ideas would shape his own intellectual development. Initially, his studies in theology and jurisprudence had provided him with a firm foundation in the Islamic sciences. However, as he delved deeper into the works of the Greek philosophers, he found that their ideas offered new and often compelling insights into the nature of existence, the cosmos, and the divine. Greek philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, provided a rational framework for understanding the world, one that emphasized logic, causality, and metaphysical principles. These ideas were highly influential in the Islamic world, particularly among the falasifa, Islamic philosophers, who sought to reconcile Greek rationalism with Islamic thought. The influence of Aristotle was particularly pronounced, as his logical system and metaphysical views provided a comprehensive structure for understanding the natural world. For Al-Ghazali, Aristotle's ideas about the nature of causality, the structure of the cosmos, and the concept of the prime mover were fascinating. Aristotle's emphasis on empirical observation and reason as tools for understanding reality appealed to Al-Ghazali's own intellectual rigor. However, despite his growing admiration for Greek philosophy, Al-Ghazali found himself increasingly unsettled by certain aspects of these philosophical systems, particularly their treatment of God and the nature of divine intervention in the world. In particular, Al-Ghazali began to question the philosophers' views on the divine. For Aristotle, the prime mover was an abstract, impersonal force that set the cosmos in motion but did not directly intervene in the world. The idea of a detached, rational universe, governed by natural laws, conflicted with the Islamic understanding of a personal, active God who intervened in the affairs of the world through revelation and miracles. This tension between Greek philosophy and Islamic theology would become a central theme in Al-Ghazali's work. While he admired the intellectual rigor of the philosophers, he began to see their ideas as insufficient for explaining the mysteries of divine action and the nature of revelation. The influence of Plotinus and Neoplatonism also played a crucial role in shaping Al-Ghazali's philosophical thinking. Plotinus' ideas about the One, the emanation of all existence from a single, unified source, resonated with the spiritual aspects of Al-Ghazali's thought. Neoplatonism emphasized the importance of the soul's ascent toward the divine, a theme that Al-Ghazali would later integrate into his own mystical writings. However, despite the spiritual allure of Neoplatonic thought, Al-Ghazali found it lacking in its ability to account for the concrete realities of the Islamic faith, particularly the belief in a personal, active God who was involved in the world. As Al-Ghazali immersed himself more deeply in the works of these philosophers, he began to feel the limitations of their rational systems. The Greek philosophers, while offering valuable insights into the natural world and the workings of the cosmos, seemed to fall short when it came to addressing the deeper questions of human existence, morality, and the nature of the divine. Al-Ghazali, having already established a deep commitment to Islamic theology, found that the philosopher's abstract concepts and reliance on reason could not adequately address the existential and spiritual concerns that were central to his faith. The tension between philosophy and theology came to a head in Al-Ghazali's monumental critique of the philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers. In this work, Al-Ghazali systematically dismantled the arguments of the Falasifa, exposing what he saw as contradictions and flaws in their reasoning. His critique focused particularly on the philosophers' denial of the possibility of miracles, their rejection of divine intervention in the world, and their reliance on human reason as the ultimate means of understanding the divine. Al-Ghazali argued that the philosophers' rationalism led them to adopt views that were incompatible with the core tenets of Islamic faith, particularly the belief in a personal, active God who revealed himself through prophets and scriptures. In Tahafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali also addressed the philosophical concept of causality, which had been central to Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought. While Aristotle and the philosophers after him viewed causality as a natural, necessary relationship between events, Al-Ghazali argued that causality itself was contingent upon the will of God. For Al-Ghazali, the idea that natural causes operated independently of divine will was problematic, as it seemed to reduce God to a distant, uninvolved creator. In contrast, Al-Ghazali's theological perspective emphasized the active role of God in the world, asserting that all causes, whether natural or supernatural, were ultimately manifestations of God's will. Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy was not a rejection of reason or intellectual inquiry altogether, but rather a call for a more balanced approach to knowledge. He argued that while reason and philosophy could offer valuable insights into the natural world, they were insufficient for understanding the divine mysteries that lay beyond human comprehension. Al-Ghazali believed that reason needed to be complemented by revelation and spiritual insight, which are the true means of knowing God. His critique of philosophy thus reflected his broader concern with the limitations of human reason and the importance of turning to spiritual practices and divine guidance for deeper knowledge. The publication of Tahafut al-Falasifa marked a turning point in Al-Ghazali's intellectual career. It brought him into direct conflict with the philosophical schools of his time, but also established him as a formidable intellectual figure. The work was widely read and debated, and its impact extended far beyond the Islamic world. It contributed to the decline of the influence of the Falasifa in the Islamic intellectual tradition, shifting the focus of Islamic philosophy away from Aristotelian rationalism and toward a more theological and mystical orientation. In the aftermath of Tahafut al-Falasifa, Al-Ghazali's relationship with philosophy became more complex. While he remained critical of the rationalism that characterized much of Greek philosophy, he also continued to value the intellectual rigor and systematic approach that philosophy offered. Al-Ghazali's own intellectual path was characterized by a synthesis of reason and revelation, a view that would shape his future work and his approach to theology, mysticism, and spirituality. His encounter with philosophy and his subsequent critique would become one of the defining moments of his career, as it set him on a path that would redefine the relationship between reason, faith, and the pursuit of knowledge. Despite his success as a scholar and the high esteem in which he was held by his peers and students, Al-Ghazali's inner life was marked by a deepening spiritual crisis. His intellectual triumphs, while impressive, began to feel insufficient for the deeper, more personal questions he grappled with in his own soul. Having reached the pinnacle of his academic career, Al-Ghazali felt increasingly alienated from the very knowledge he had spent years acquiring. His extensive studies in philosophy, theology, and jurisprudence, which had once provided him with intellectual clarity and security, no longer seemed to offer answers to the existential questions that were troubling him. At the heart of this crisis was a growing sense of doubt about the ability of reason alone to lead one to true knowledge of the divine. Al-Ghazali had spent years refining his intellect, learning from the greatest minds of his time. Yet, as he delved deeper into philosophy and theology, he began to feel that no matter how much knowledge he amassed, it was insufficient for addressing the deeper mysteries of existence, purpose, and God. His doubts extended not only to philosophy, but also to the very foundations of Islamic theology. Despite his profound commitment to Islamic teachings, Al-Ghazali began to wonder whether his intellectual understanding of the faith had truly led him to the spiritual insights and experiences he sought. This crisis of faith reached its peak when Al-Ghazali began to question the sincerity of his own beliefs and the authenticity of the knowledge he had so ardently pursued. His doubts were not simply about the content of the intellectual systems he had studied, but about the very nature of human knowledge itself. Al-Ghazali had come to realize that even the most rigorous intellectual exercises were ultimately limited in their capacity to reveal the truth of God's nature. The rational, logical systems that he had spent years mastering, and that had made him one of the most renowned scholars of his time, now seemed hollow and unable to answer the profound questions that weighed heavily on his heart. In the face of this intellectual exhaustion and spiritual crisis, Al-Ghazali decided to step away from his position at the Nizamiya College, leaving behind his prestigious career, his students, and his academic accolades. The decision to abandon the world he had known was not made lightly. Al-Ghazali had spent years building his reputation as a leading scholar, and his withdrawal from the public eye was a drastic move that shocked his colleagues and students. However, Al-Ghazali believed that in order to find true peace, he needed to retreat from the intellectual world that had become a source of confusion and disillusionment. It was not just a matter of stepping away from teaching. It was a matter of seeking a deeper, more direct experience of the divine, beyond the realm of abstract knowledge. Al-Ghazali's withdrawal from the academic world marked the beginning of a profound spiritual transformation. He left Baghdad and journeyed to the mountains of Kurdistan, where he sought solitude in order to reflect on his life, his faith, and his relationship with God. His time in seclusion was marked by intense spiritual struggles, as Al-Ghazali wrestled with his doubts and sought to discover the truth that had eluded him in his intellectual pursuits. It was during this period of solitude that Al-Ghazali began to experience what would later be described as his spiritual awakening. As Al-Ghazali spent time in isolation, he turned inward, seeking not answers from books or scholars, but from within himself. His prayer, meditation, and contemplation became central to his spiritual practice. He began to engage with the Islamic tradition in a new way, focusing on the inner dimensions of faith rather than the outer, intellectual aspects. Al-Ghazali's understanding of Islam shifted from being primarily an intellectual exercise to a deeply personal, lived experience. It was in this period of spiritual retreat that Al-Ghazali had what he would later describe as a profound revelation, a realization that the true path to God was not through intellectual knowledge alone, but through an experiential understanding of the divine, cultivated through worship, devotion, and mysticism. Al-Ghazali's spiritual awakening was not immediate or easy. His doubts continued to challenge him, and there were moments of despair when he questioned whether he would ever find the peace and clarity he sought. However, through persistent prayer and reflection, Al-Ghazali began to experience moments of divine connection and insight. He came to understand that knowledge of God was not something that could be attained solely through reason or philosophy, but through an open heart and a sincere desire to know the divine. This understanding marked the beginning of his transformation into a mystic, and it would profoundly shape his later writings and teachings. It was during this period of introspection and spiritual growth that Al-Ghazali encountered the teachings of Sufism, the mystical tradition within Islam. Sufism emphasizes the inner dimensions of faith, focusing on personal experience, divine love, and direct union with God. The Sufis' emphasis on the purification of the heart and soul resonated deeply with Al-Ghazali, who had grown disillusioned with intellectualism and sought a more personal, transformative connection with God. His engagement with Sufism would become one of the defining features of his later works, particularly his influential book Ihya Ulum al-Din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, which sought to bring together the outer practices of Islam with the inner, mystical dimensions of the faith. Al-Ghazali's new spiritual perspective was not a rejection of the intellectual rigor that had characterized his earlier career, but rather a reorientation of his focus. He began to see the pursuit of knowledge as a means to purify the soul and draw closer to God, rather than as an end in itself. In his writings, he emphasized the importance of sincerity, humility, and devotion in the pursuit of spiritual knowledge. He believed that true knowledge was not confined to the intellectual realm, but could be found in the cultivation of the heart and soul through worship and ethical conduct. The crisis of faith that Al-Ghazali experienced was thus not a permanent state of doubt or despair, but rather a transformative process that led to a deeper understanding of his own spirituality. His journey from intellectual certainty to spiritual humility marked a pivotal moment in his life, one that would influence his future works and his role in the development of Islamic thought. Al-Ghazali's spiritual awakening allowed him to synthesize his vast knowledge of Islamic law, philosophy, and theology with the insights he gained from Sufism, creating a unique and profound vision of Islam that integrated both the intellectual and the spiritual dimensions of the faith. In the years that followed, Al-Ghazali would go on to write some of the most influential works in Islamic thought, addressing not only theological and philosophical issues, but also exploring the deeper, mystical aspects of the faith. His crisis of faith and subsequent spiritual awakening became the foundation for his lifelong mission, to bring about a revival of the inner, spiritual dimensions of Islam, helping Muslims to reconnect with the core principles of devotion, sincerity, and humility before God. After years of profound spiritual reflection and the inward journey that had reshaped his relationship with knowledge and God, Al-Ghazali emerged from his retreat with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. His time in seclusion had not only deepened his faith, but it also prompted him to reconsider the role of scholarship in his life. The intellectual crisis that had once driven him to withdraw from the world had been resolved, but not by turning away from knowledge altogether. Instead, Al-Ghazali now saw the pursuit of knowledge as an essential part of the spiritual journey, a means to purify the heart and bring one closer to the divine. With this new understanding, Al-Ghazali felt a calling to return to public life, not merely as a scholar, but as a teacher and a spiritual guide who could help others navigate the delicate balance between intellectual pursuit and spiritual devotion. Al-Ghazali's return to public life was marked by a shift in his approach to teaching. He no longer saw himself as just a professor of Islamic jurisprudence or theology. He viewed himself as a spiritual guide, one who could help others attain a deeper understanding of both the outer and inner aspects of the Islamic faith. His teachings were infused with the wisdom he had gained from his spiritual retreat and his engagement with Sufism, a mystical tradition that emphasized the purification of the soul and direct experience of God. He began to integrate Sufi practices such as meditation, dhikr, remembrance of God, and self-reflection into his scholarly work, believing that these practices were not separate from, but rather complementary to the intellectual study of Islam. It was during this time that Al-Ghazali wrote his most famous work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, which would go on to become one of the most influential books in Islamic thought. The Ihya sought to bridge the gap between the outward practices of Islam, such as prayer, fasting, and charity, and the inner, spiritual dimensions of the faith. Al-Ghazali believed that true religious life required not only the proper performance of religious duties, but also a deep, internal transformation of the heart. For him, acts of worship were not merely rituals. They were means by which a person could purify their soul and draw closer to God. In the Ihya, he provided guidance on how to achieve this transformation, emphasizing the importance of sincerity, humility, and mindfulness in one's relationship with God. The Ihya was divided into 4 main sections, each focusing on a different aspect of religious life. The first section dealt with the importance of knowledge and how to acquire it. Al-Ghazali stressed that knowledge was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a means to purify the heart and soul. He argued that true knowledge led to humility and piety, and that the pursuit of knowledge must be undertaken with the intention of pleasing God. The second section focused on acts of worship, such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage. Al-Ghazali emphasized that these acts should be performed not out of habit or for show, but with a sincere intention to seek closeness to God. In the third section, Al-Ghazali turned his attention to ethical conduct, highlighting the importance of virtues such as honesty, patience, and generosity. He believed that the inner transformation required for true religious devotion could not be achieved without the cultivation of good character. The final section of the Ihya addressed the deeper, mystical dimensions of Islam, focusing on the purification of the soul through practices like dhikr, meditation, and contemplation. Here, Al-Ghazali drew heavily on his own experiences in Sufism, urging readers to go beyond mere intellectual understanding and to seek a direct, experiential connection with the divine. One of the key themes of the Ihya was the idea that knowledge and spiritual practice were inseparable. Al-Ghazali argued that intellectual knowledge of Islam was necessary, but it was not sufficient on its own. He emphasized that true knowledge could only be attained when it was combined with a deep, personal commitment to worship and self-purification. This was a message that resonated with many of his contemporaries, who had become increasingly concerned with the decline of spirituality in Islamic society. Al-Ghazali's teachings provided a way for Muslims to reconnect with the spiritual core of their faith, reminding them that religion was not just a set of outward rituals, but a path to inner transformation. The Ihya became an immediate success and had a profound impact on Islamic thought. It was widely studied and taught in Islamic schools and became a central text in the development of both Islamic theology and Sufism. Al-Ghazali's synthesis of intellectual and spiritual knowledge provided a model for future scholars who sought to combine rigorous scholarship with a deep, personal connection to God. His work was praised not only for its intellectual depth, but also for its practical guidance in living a life of piety and devotion. Despite the success of the Ihya, Al-Ghazali's return to public life was not without challenges. His efforts to integrate Sufism into mainstream Islamic thought were met with resistance from certain factions within the religious establishment. Some conservative scholars viewed Sufism with suspicion, seeing it as a deviation from Orthodox Islam. They criticized Al-Ghazali for promoting mystical practices that they believed were not in line with the traditional teachings of the Quran and Hadith. Al-Ghazali, however, defended Sufism, arguing that it was a legitimate path to spiritual growth and that it complemented rather than contradicted the teachings of Islam. In response to his critics, Al-Ghazali wrote a number of works in defense of Sufism, including Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, The Deliverer from Error, in which he outlined his personal spiritual journey and explained why he had embraced Sufism. In this work, Al-Ghazali recounted his doubts and struggles with philosophy and theology, describing how his search for truth had led him to mystical practices. He also responded to criticisms of Sufism, arguing that the mystical path was not a rejection of reason or orthodoxy, but a way of deepening one's relationship with God. Al-Ghazali's defense of Sufism helped to legitimize the mystical tradition within the broader Islamic intellectual community. Al-Ghazali's teachings and writings continued to shape the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the Islamic world throughout his life. His ability to combine rigorous scholarship with deep spirituality made him a unique figure in Islamic thought, and his influence extended far beyond his own time. His works were studied and revered by generations of scholars and mystics, and his vision of a balanced, integrated approach to knowledge and spirituality continues to inspire Muslims around the world today. By the end of his life, Al-Ghazali had become one of the most respected and influential figures in Islamic history. His contributions to Islamic theology, philosophy, and mysticism were unparalleled, and his ability to bridge the gap between reason and spirituality made him a central figure in the intellectual history of the Islamic world. Al-Ghazali's legacy was not only in his scholarly achievements, but also in the way he transformed the way Muslims approach their faith, emphasizing the importance of both intellectual rigor and spiritual devotion in the quest for a deeper connection with God. Al-Ghazali's intellectual and spiritual journey had already shaped him into one of the most profound thinkers of his time. His teachings, blending rigorous scholarship with deep spirituality, made him a respected authority in both theological and mystical circles. Yet, despite his personal retreats and the introspective nature of his work, Al-Ghazali was not an isolated figure. His thoughts on the role of the scholar and the relationship between religion and politics would lead him to engage deeply with the broader societal issues of his day. As Al-Ghazali sought to reform the inner lives of individuals, he also recognized the need for broader societal reform, one that aligned Islamic governance with ethical principles and spiritual values. By the time Al-Ghazali had returned to public life, the Islamic world was experiencing significant political turbulence. The Seljuk Empire, under which Al-Ghazali had once served as a professor, was facing internal strife, and corruption had begun to take root within both the political elite and religious institutions. The Muslim community was divided, and many of the rulers were criticized for their failure to govern justly according to Islamic principles. As a scholar, Al-Ghazali had always advocated for ethical behavior and moral leadership, but the political instability of his time forced him to think more deeply about the intersection between religion and governance. This awareness of political dysfunction led Al-Ghazali to reflect on the role of the scholar in shaping public life. He saw the relationship between rulers and scholars as crucial in ensuring that Islamic law, or Sharia, was upheld with integrity. He believed that scholars had a responsibility not only to guide the individual soul, but also to help create a just society where the values of Islam were reflected in the laws and policies of the state. At the same time, Al-Ghazali recognized that scholars had an obligation to act with moral courage, challenging corrupt rulers and institutions when necessary. Al-Ghazali's views on governance were deeply rooted in his understanding of Islamic ethics. He emphasized that a ruler's primary responsibility was to uphold justice and protect the well-being of the people. He believed that the ruler's role was not one of unchecked authority, but rather one that required humility and accountability to God. For Al-Ghazali, the ideal ruler was one who sought to govern according to the principles of the Quran and Hadith, placing the welfare of the people above personal ambition or power. In his work Nasihat al-Muluk, Advice to Kings, Al-Ghazali offered practical advice to rulers on how to govern justly. This treatise became one of his most influential political works, offering guidance on how rulers should relate to their subjects and the role of scholars in advising the government. Al-Ghazali argued that rulers should surround themselves with wise and ethical advisors who could help them make decisions that aligned with Islamic principles. He also stressed that rulers should be mindful of their own moral conduct, warning them that their actions will be judged by God. Al-Ghazali's emphasis on the role of the scholar in politics was also a call for intellectual engagement in the public sphere. He believed that scholars had a moral duty to speak truth to power, even when doing so was difficult or dangerous. While many scholars of his time had become entrenched in the courtly life or sought to maintain their positions of influence by currying favor with rulers, Al-Ghazali rejected this approach. He warned that scholars who aligned themselves too closely with corrupt rulers risked losing their integrity and becoming complicit in injustice. For Al-Ghazali, true scholarship required independence of mind and a commitment to speaking out against wrongdoings, regardless of the political consequences. Despite his call for scholars to engage in politics, Al-Ghazali was also cautious about the dangers of excessive political involvement. He believed that scholars should not become so absorbed in the affairs of the state that they neglected their spiritual and intellectual duties. The scholar's ultimate allegiance, in Al-Ghazali's view, was to God and to the pursuit of knowledge, not to any political faction or ruler. His writings reflect his belief that a scholar's primary role was to guide the people toward righteousness and to maintain the integrity of Islamic law, regardless of the political climate. Al-Ghazali's thoughts on governance were also influenced by his understanding of human nature and the nature of power. He recognized that power was often abused and that rulers could be swayed by personal interests and desires. In his treatises, he explored the psychological factors that led to corrupt leadership, such as arrogance, greed, and a lack of self-awareness. He believed that rulers and scholars alike had to engage in constant self-reflection and strive for humility in order to avoid falling prey to these vices. He advocated for an ethical approach to leadership that emphasized justice, compassion, and accountability. The political context in which Al-Ghazali lived was also deeply shaped by the tensions between various factions within the Muslim world. The Abbasid Caliphate, once a symbol of Islamic unity, had lost much of its power, and regional rulers were asserting their independence. Al-Ghazali witnessed firsthand the rise of these independent dynasties, many of which were more focused on consolidating their own power than on upholding the ethical ideals of Islam. For Al-Ghazali, this fragmentation of the Islamic world was a source of deep concern, and he believed that the moral decay within political structures was a reflection of broader societal issues. In his political writings, Al-Ghazali called for a return to the fundamental principles of Islamic governance as outlined in the Quran and Hadith. He argued that the true strength of a state lay not in its military might or political alliances, but in the moral integrity of its leadership and the justice of its laws. Al-Ghazali envisioned a society where the rulers, scholars, and people worked together to ensure that the principles of justice, equity, and piety were upheld in all aspects of life. His writings sought to remind rulers and citizens alike that Islam was a comprehensive way of life that encompassed not just personal piety, but also social responsibility. Al-Ghazali's political engagement did not stop with theoretical writings. He sought to practice what he preached by advising rulers and participating in political discourse. While he was not directly involved in the day-to-day workings of the government, his reputation as a scholar and spiritual guide made his advice highly sought after by leaders in the region. Al-Ghazali's influence on political thought extended beyond his own time, shaping subsequent generations of Muslim scholars and thinkers who would wrestle with the relationship between religion and politics. As Al-Ghazali grew older, his political and intellectual legacy became increasingly clear. His call for ethical leadership, grounded in Islamic principles, continued to resonate with Muslim rulers and scholars alike. His ideas about the role of the scholar in society, their duty to speak truth to power, to engage in the public sphere with moral integrity, and to maintain their independence from political corruption, would become central to the development of Islamic political thought in the centuries to come. Al-Ghazali's death in 1111 marked the end of a distinguished life, but the impact of his intellectual, spiritual, and social contributions lived on, shaping the course of Islamic thought for centuries. His legacy was far-reaching, touching not only theology and philosophy, but also the way in which Islam was understood and practiced on a personal, spiritual, and societal level. While his life was marked by inner conflict, spiritual awakening, and scholarly excellence, the lasting influence of his work stemmed from his ability to bridge diverse traditions, from orthodox jurisprudence to Sufism, and from philosophy to mysticism. His ability to synthesize different schools of thought made him a central figure in the development of Islamic intellectual history. One of the most notable aspects of Al-Ghazali's legacy is his integration of Islamic law, theology, and mysticism. Before Al-Ghazali's time, Islamic intellectual life was largely divided into distinct intellectual spheres: jurisprudence, philosophy, and mysticism. Each tradition had its own methods of inquiry and ways of understanding the world, and often these approaches were seen as separate or even contradictory. Al-Ghazali's genius lay in his ability to unify these disciplines, showing that they were not inherently in conflict but could complement each other. In his view, the pursuit of knowledge, whether in the realm of law, theology, or mysticism, was ultimately a way to bring one closer to God. Al-Ghazali's most influential work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, demonstrated his capacity for synthesizing these various streams of Islamic thought. In it, he merged Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, with Sufism, Islamic mysticism, and theology, kalam, offering a comprehensive vision of Islam that emphasized not just outward practices, but also the inner transformation of the soul. He taught that the outward practice of religious duties, such as prayer, fasting, and charity was essential, but these actions were insufficient without the proper spiritual intentions and purification of the heart. This was a novel perspective at the time, as many intellectuals focused primarily on either the external aspects of the faith or the theoretical aspects, while Al-Ghazali insisted on a holistic, integrated approach to religion. Beyond the Ihya, Al-Ghazali's contributions to Islamic philosophy were profound. His critique of Aristotelian philosophy, particularly in his famous work Tahafut al-Falasifa, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, marked a turning point in Islamic intellectual history. Al-Ghazali's criticism was not a rejection of philosophy per se, but rather a challenge to the uncritical acceptance of certain Greek philosophical ideas that, in his view, conflicted with Islamic teachings. He specifically criticized the philosophers' views on the nature of God, the eternity of the world, and the possibility of miracles, arguing that these ideas were incompatible with the teachings of the Quran and Hadith. Al-Ghazali's arguments had a lasting impact, and many later philosophers and theologians, both Muslim and non-Muslim, engaged with his work in an effort to reconcile philosophy and religion. His critique of philosophy, particularly the work of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Farabi, solidified Al-Ghazali's role in defining the parameters of Islamic thought. While he dismantled the metaphysical systems of the philosophers, he also provided an alternative framework for understanding the relationship between reason and faith. Al-Ghazali argued that reason could play an important role in understanding God and the world, but must be subordinated to revelation. For Al-Ghazali, the Quran and Hadith were the ultimate sources of truth, and any philosophy that contradicted these sources was to be rejected. This perspective became a hallmark of Sunni orthodoxy in the centuries that followed. Al-Ghazali's influence extended well beyond the realm of theology and philosophy. His writings also contributed to the development of Islamic education and religious practice. He championed the idea that religious education should not be confined to the mere transmission of knowledge, but should aim to cultivate virtue and piety in students. In his view, the role of a teacher was not simply to impart intellectual knowledge, but to guide students toward moral and spiritual refinement. This pedagogical vision influenced the development of Islamic educational institutions, particularly the madrasa system, which became the primary centers of learning throughout the Muslim world. Moreover, Al-Ghazali's emphasis on spiritual development through Sufism helped to shape the development of Islamic mysticism. While Sufism had existed as a distinct tradition within Islam before Al-Ghazali's time, his writings helped to legitimize and popularize Sufi practices among the broader Muslim community. In his later works, he extolled the virtues of self-purification, meditation, and the remembrance of God, arguing that these practices were essential for anyone seeking to draw closer to the divine. His integration of Sufi practices into mainstream Islamic thought contributed to the widespread acceptance of Sufism as a legitimate and essential aspect of the Islamic tradition. In addition to his intellectual and spiritual contributions, Al-Ghazali's impact on Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, was also significant. His work as a jurist had already earned him widespread recognition, but his later writings further cemented his reputation as one of the leading figures in Islamic legal thought. He was deeply concerned with the ethical dimensions of law and believed that the law should serve not only to regulate external behavior, but also to guide individuals toward personal and spiritual growth. His focus on the ethical and spiritual underpinnings of Islamic law helped to deepen the understanding of law as a means of fostering social justice and moral rectitude. The impact of Al-Ghazali's work was not limited to his lifetime. His ideas continued to shape Islamic thought and practice for centuries after his death. In the medieval period, his influence was felt across the Muslim world, from the Maghrib to Persia, as scholars and mystics grappled with his ideas and sought to build upon them. His works were translated into many languages, including Persian, Turkish, and Latin, making his ideas accessible to a broader audience. In the Ottoman Empire, Al-Ghazali's ideas were incorporated into the curriculum of religious schools, ensuring that his teachings continued to be studied for generations. Al-Ghazali's influence also extended to the broader intellectual and spiritual landscape of the Islamic world. His critiques of philosophy and his emphasis on the unity of faith and practice resonated with later theologians and mystics, such as Ibn Arabi, who developed a more cosmological and mystical understanding of God and the universe. His views on the relationship between reason and revelation were also taken up by later scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah, who built upon Al-Ghazali's ideas to critique the influence of Greek philosophy on Islamic thought. In the modern era, Al-Ghazali's legacy has continued to inspire scholars, theologians, and reformers within the Muslim world. His ability to reconcile reason with faith and his emphasis on the inner dimensions of religion have made him an enduring figure in contemporary Islamic thought. His works continue to be read, studied, and debated by scholars seeking to understand the relationship between Islam and modernity, and his emphasis on the purification of the soul remains central to Islamic spiritual practices today. Al-Ghazali's influence also extended beyond the Muslim world. In the West, his writings, especially the incoherence of the philosophers, were translated into Latin and had an impact on Christian philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, who engaged with Al-Ghazali's critiques of Aristotelianism. This cross-cultural exchange helped to shape the development of medieval European philosophy, particularly in the areas of metaphysics and epistemology. Al-Ghazali's contributions to Islamic thought may have been deeply embedded in the medieval world, but the wisdom and insights he offered continue to resonate in the modern age. His work not only bridged gaps between different intellectual traditions of his time, but it also laid the groundwork for ongoing debates about the nature of knowledge, spirituality, and the role of religion in public life. Today, Al-Ghazali's teachings serve as a rich source of guidance, offering reflections on the challenges of contemporary Muslim life, the relationship between faith and reason, and the pursuit of inner peace in a fast-paced, often materialistic world. One of the key aspects of Al-Ghazali's work that remains relevant today is his approach to the relationship between spirituality and daily life. In an age where religion can often seem compartmentalized, Al-Ghazali emphasized the interconnectedness of belief, practice, and inner transformation. His insistence that every act of the believer, no matter how mundane, could be an expression of devotion to God, challenges the modern notion that religion is something separate from the practical realities of life. He believed that true spirituality was not confined to rituals or prayer, but was reflected in how one interacted with the world, through honesty, integrity, humility, and the pursuit of justice. In an era where many Muslims are grappling with the pressures of modernity, Al-Ghazali's teachings on the inner purification of the soul are especially pertinent. His concept of tazkiyah, spiritual purification, addresses the human tendency toward egoism, pride, and materialism, issues that are all too familiar in today's world. Al-Ghazali taught that the heart must be cleansed of these destructive traits in order to establish a deeper connection with God. His approach to spiritual purification is not an abstract or theoretical one, but a practical method that involves self-reflection, meditation, and striving for personal transformation. In a world dominated by external pressures, Al-Ghazali's emphasis on inward spiritual growth offers a counterbalance to the distractions and anxieties that often accompany modern life. Moreover, Al-Ghazali's critique of the role of reason in understanding the divine and human existence continues to be of great importance. In Tahafut al-Falasifa, he challenged the prevailing reliance on Aristotelian logic and philosophy to explain all aspects of existence, arguing that reason alone could not fully capture the nature of God or the spiritual world. This critique of over-reliance on rationalism resonates with modern debates surrounding the limits of science and reason, particularly in an age where scientific progress often claims to have answers for everything. Al-Ghazali's insistence that there are truths beyond the grasp of human intellect offers a profound counterpoint to the materialistic worldview that dominates much of the modern era. Al-Ghazali's relationship with philosophy and his critique of certain philosophical schools provide valuable insights into the contemporary discourse on the compatibility between faith and reason. His argument that philosophy and theology can coexist, as long as philosophy does not contradict the foundational principles of Islam, offers a middle ground for modern Muslims who seek to reconcile their faith with intellectual pursuits. This balance between reason and revelation, where both are seen as tools for understanding the world, but must be subordinated to the divine will, offers a nuanced perspective for those navigating the complex relationship between religion and modernity. In terms of Islamic jurisprudence, Al-Ghazali's approach to law and ethics also has significant implications for contemporary Muslim societies. His view that the purpose of law is not only to regulate behavior, but also to nurture moral and spiritual growth speaks to the ongoing challenges faced by modern Islamic legal systems. Many Muslim countries today face debates about how to balance the requirements of traditional Islamic law with the realities of contemporary life. Al-Ghazali's teachings about the ethical dimensions of law and governance provide a framework for thinking about how Islamic legal principles can address the moral challenges of the modern world. Al-Ghazali's emphasis on social justice and the ethical treatment of others has enduring relevance, particularly in a world where issues such as poverty, inequality, and human rights are of increasing concern. He understood that a just society was one in which the welfare of the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized was prioritized. His call for rulers and scholars to act with compassion and justice resonates with the aspirations of many Muslims today who seek to live in societies that uphold Islamic values of equity and social justice. His works have been interpreted by contemporary Islamic scholars to advocate for the empowerment of marginalized communities and the promotion of human rights within Islamic frameworks. Furthermore, Al-Ghazali's engagement with Sufism has had a lasting impact on the role of mysticism in contemporary Islamic practice. His endorsement of Sufi practices, particularly the cultivation of personal connection with God through acts of devotion, prayer, and remembrance, continues to inspire countless Muslims today. In an age where many Muslims feel disconnected from the deep spiritual practices of their faith, Al-Ghazali's teachings offer a pathway for rekindling a sense of spiritual intimacy and devotion. His writings on the inner dimensions of worship provide modern Muslims with tools for deepening their spiritual lives, regardless of the external circumstances they may face. Al-Ghazali's emphasis on the purification of the heart also provides valuable insights for Muslims confronting the challenges of materialism and consumerism in the modern world. His focus on internal spirituality, as opposed to external displays of piety, is especially relevant in a time when religious observance can sometimes be reduced to ritualistic practices without deeper spiritual engagement. In the consumer-driven world of today, where individuals are often encouraged to define their worth by material success, Al-Ghazali's teachings serve as a reminder that true fulfillment lies in the cultivation of inner virtue, self-awareness, and devotion to God. The legacy of Al-Ghazali is also evident in the modern intellectual revival of Islamic thought, particularly in the works of reformers and scholars who seek to reconcile traditional Islamic teachings with the demands of contemporary society. Scholars in the fields of theology, philosophy, and law have found Al-Ghazali's synthesis of reason and faith to be a vital resource in addressing modern concerns. His ability to navigate complex intellectual terrains, whether in his critiques of philosophy, his discussions on mysticism, or his reflections on ethics, makes him a timeless figure whose work continues to inspire and challenge new generations of thinkers. Finally, Al-Ghazali's impact is not limited to the Muslim world. His works, particularly those critiquing Aristotelian philosophy, have influenced Western thought as well. His critique of the limits of reason and his articulation of the relationship between faith and philosophy made their way into European intellectual circles, especially during the Middle Ages. In particular, Christian philosophers, including Thomas Aquinas, engaged with Al-Ghazali's ideas in their own attempts to reconcile faith and reason. This cross-cultural influence demonstrates the universality of Al-Ghazali's thought, highlighting his position as a central figure in the intellectual history of both the Islamic and Western worlds. As we conclude the story of Al-Ghazali, it is impossible to overlook the remarkable legacy of a man whose influence continues to transcend time and geography. Al-Ghazali's life, ideas, and contributions shaped not only the intellectual landscape of the Islamic world during the medieval period, but also provided enduring insights for generations across different cultures and religious traditions. His intellectual and spiritual journey, from a young scholar seeking knowledge to a mystic who found peace in surrendering to God, represents a path that many continue to follow, both in Islamic and broader philosophical contexts. His ability to synthesize complex ideas while never losing sight of the spiritual dimension of life remains a model for contemporary thinkers. Al-Ghazali's commitment to integrating the mind with the heart, the rational with the spiritual, and the outwardly visible practices of religion with its inward, transformative core serves as a profound reminder in today's world. In an age often characterized by division between science and faith, between rationality and spirituality, his work stands as an invitation to reconsider the possibility of harmony between these seemingly disparate forces. His life demonstrated that true understanding, whether of the self, society, or the divine, requires both intellectual rigor and emotional depth. In a modern context, where many seek fulfillment through material success or intellectual achievement, Al-Ghazali's holistic approach to life remains an important corrective to the prevailing trends of superficiality and fragmentation. Al-Ghazali's approach to education also carries weight in today's world, particularly in how we think about the purpose of learning. His emphasis on the ethical and spiritual dimensions of knowledge challenges the contemporary educational model, which often prioritizes technical proficiency and economic utility over personal growth and moral development. In his view, true education was not just about acquiring facts, but about shaping the soul and building character. His belief that knowledge should ultimately lead to wisdom, inner peace, and a deeper connection with the Creator provides a much-needed perspective in an era where education systems frequently fail to address the deeper, more existential questions of human life. As modern educational systems continue to evolve, Al-Ghazali's teachings invite reflection on how knowledge can serve not just individual success, but the broader good of society. The depth of Al-Ghazali's contribution to Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, has also left an indelible mark on the way Muslims understand the law. His belief that legal knowledge must be infused with ethical and spiritual dimensions stands as an important reminder for today's Muslim scholars and lawmakers. In contemporary discussions about the role of Islamic law in modern governance, Al-Ghazali's work offers invaluable guidance. He understood that law was not just a system of rules to regulate behavior. It was a moral compass that guided individuals toward a life of righteousness. His emphasis on the welfare of society and the individual's personal transformation through adherence to the law remains central to debates about the role of law in ensuring justice, equity, and moral integrity in modern Muslim-majority societies. Moreover, Al-Ghazali's contributions to Islamic mysticism, or Sufism, continue to influence modern spiritual practices. His writings offer profound insights into the nature of the soul and the path toward divine closeness through purification and remembrance. The essence of Sufism, seeking God through love, devotion, and surrender, remains a deeply cherished aspect of Islamic spirituality. As the world grapples with the pressures of materialism and the loss of spiritual meaning in modern life, Al-Ghazali's teachings on the purification of the heart offer timeless wisdom. His exploration of how inner peace is cultivated through self-awareness, meditation, and prayer provides a pathway for those seeking spiritual grounding in an increasingly chaotic world. Al-Ghazali's view of the relationship between reason and faith also resonates in today's dialogue between science and religion. He was neither a blind adherent to dogma nor a champion of unchecked rationalism. Rather, he saw both reason and faith as complementary tools for understanding the world. In his critique of philosophers who relied too heavily on reason at the expense of divine revelation, Al-Ghazali reminded us of the limitations of human knowledge. This notion is particularly relevant today as scientific advancements raise questions about the nature of existence, the universe, and even human consciousness. Al-Ghazali's work invites contemporary thinkers to consider that there are boundaries to human reason, and some truths, particularly those about the divine, can only be understood through spiritual insight. In the realm of interfaith dialogue, Al-Ghazali's work offers a bridge between Islam and other intellectual traditions. His critiques of Greek philosophy and his engagement with earlier Christian and Jewish thinkers showed a recognition of the intellectual richness that could be drawn from outside the Islamic tradition. His ability to engage critically with ideas, without dismissing them outright, is a valuable example for the modern world, which is increasingly interconnected but also polarized in its intellectual and religious pursuits. By encouraging engagement with diverse traditions of thought, Al-Ghazali's legacy provides a foundation for fostering mutual understanding and respect among people of different faiths and worldviews, particularly in an age where religious and ideological differences often seem to create insurmountable divides. Al-Ghazali's impact extended far beyond his own lifetime. His works were studied by later generations of Islamic scholars and philosophers who found in them a rich source of wisdom. His synthesis of theology, philosophy, and mysticism influenced the works of major thinkers like Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiyyah, and many others. His critiques of Aristotelian thought shaped the development of Islamic philosophy in the centuries that followed. Even within the broader intellectual tradition, Al-Ghazali's ideas reached thinkers in the West, including medieval European philosophers who were introduced to his critiques through Latin translations. Al-Ghazali's work, therefore, represents a link between different cultures, intellectual traditions, and religious communities. In addition to his intellectual contributions, Al-Ghazali's legacy lives on through the many spiritual practices that bear his influence. His emphasis on the purification of the soul, the importance of sincerity in worship, and the cultivation of humility have shaped generations of Sufi mystics. The rituals of remembrance, dhikr, and self-reflection that he promoted remain a vital part of the spiritual practices of millions of Muslims around the world today. His insistence on the centrality of inner transformation over outward appearances continues to shape not only the way Muslims understand spirituality, but also the way they engage with their world. The relevance of Al-Ghazali's legacy can also be seen in contemporary Islamic reform movements that seek to reconcile the challenges of modern life with traditional Islamic teachings. Al-Ghazali's work provides a framework for reformers who wish to engage with modernity without sacrificing the spiritual core of Islam. His ability to adapt his thoughts to address the challenges of his time offers a model for contemporary thinkers who seek to adapt Islamic thought to contemporary contexts while preserving its essence. In doing so, Al-Ghazali's thought remains a living tradition, one that invites ongoing dialogue and reflection. In the final analysis, Al-Ghazali's enduring spirit lies not just in his vast body of work or his intellectual achievements, but in the way his teachings continue to resonate with people across time and space. His life was one of transformation, from scholars seeking worldly knowledge to a mystic seeking divine proximity. In his own journey, he exemplified the very message he imparted, that true knowledge is not merely intellectual, but deeply transformative, reshaping both the individual and the world around them. In a world that continues to grapple with issues of faith, knowledge, and personal meaning, Al-Ghazali's life and work offer a powerful reminder that the pursuit of truth is as much about spiritual growth and inner peace as it is about intellectual exploration. His legacy, therefore, is not bound by the past, but remains a vibrant and relevant force in the lives of those who continue to seek the deeper truths of existence.